Millionaire ignores lost child on the street, but her identity will change his life forever. The limousine's tires sloshed through the flooded streets as the night deepened into a bitter chill. Inside the sleek, black car, Alexander Knight sat alone, staring out of the window, his face lit by the occasional flicker of streetlights reflecting off the wet asphalt. The city seemed so small from this height, a playground of wealth and power, and Alexander was its undisputed king. The night had been another triumph for him. A lucrative business deal closed with promises of even more riches. And yet, as he sat there in his solitude, something gnawed at him. He had everything, but it always felt like something was missing. But that something would not be found on this rainy street. As the car approached the intersection, something caught his eye. A small figure, huddled in the shadows beneath a street lamp, drenched by the downpour. A girl, no older than 8 or 9, standing alone in the rain, her clothes ragged and soaked through. She looked lost, confused, her face pale beneath a mop of dark, tangled hair. The sight should have stirred something, pity, perhaps, or even concern. But Alexander barely spared her a glance. "Drive on," he instructed his driver curtly, his voice as cold as the night air. The car moved forward, leaving the child behind, disappearing into the darkness as though she had never existed at all. In that brief moment, as the rain battered the windows, something twisted deep inside Alexander's chest. But it was gone before he could acknowledge it. He had no time for such distractions. The world had no room for weakness, and certainly no room for the broken. And yet, the image of that girl lingered, a ghost on the edges of his mind. It didn't matter. She was just another forgotten soul in a city of millions, lost in the storm. Nothing more. Maya stood motionless in the downpour, her tiny hands clutching a ragged doll to her chest, her eyes wide and lost. She hadn't meant to end up here. The street was unfamiliar, the faces passing her by strangers, their indifferent glances as cold as the night air. She didn't know where to go, where to turn. Her stomach growled in hunger. But she hadn't eaten in hours, or had it been days? Time blurred in the haze of the storm. She thought of her mother. Would she be looking for her? Or was she too far away, caught in some other world, a world that Maya couldn't reach? She missed her, but she didn't know where she had gone, only that she had disappeared without a trace. Maya's eyes drifted to a building ahead, its lights flickering like distant stars, a safe haven, maybe. She moved toward it, her steps hesitant but determined. She would find someone to help her. There had to be someone kind enough, someone who would care. The door opened with a soft creak, and Maya slipped inside, trying to avoid the scrutiny of the people who sat inside. She had no idea what kind of place it was, but she hoped someone would see her, would understand her silent plea. Inside, the room was warm, bustling with people dressed in suits, laughing and talking, glasses clinking in celebration. No one seemed to notice her, and Maya felt smaller than ever before, invisible in a world that was too big, too loud. But then she saw him, a tall man, standing at the center of the room, his presence commanding. Alexander Knight. Maya didn't know who he was, but his gaze briefly locked with hers. For a second, she thought he might approach, might ask her if she was lost. But the moment passed, and his eyes drifted away. The sense of abandonment she had felt on the street returned, stronger now, mixing with a deep, bitter sadness. She wasn't even worth a second glance. She lowered her head, retreating into the shadows, clinging to her doll as the world moved on around her. The night was still heavy with rain, but inside the lavish penthouse, the warmth and buzz of the party remained undisturbed by the storm outside. Alexander moved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with clients and colleagues, his mind elsewhere. He had grown tired of the facades, the endless toasts and empty promises. In the glow of crystal chandeliers, he felt more disconnected than ever, a puppet master without strings, playing roles that no longer interested him. His empire was built on achievements, but his soul felt barren, a hollow monument to ambition. As he made his way toward the balcony, hoping for a moment of solitude, his gaze flicked toward the back of the room. There, Just at the edge of the shadows stood the girl from the street. Maya. She hadn't noticed him yet, her head bent low, hiding behind a tall potted plant, clutching the doll to her chest as though it was her last lifeline. Alexander's breath caught for a moment, a strange feeling twisting in his gut. Why was she here? What was she doing in his world, among people who belonged nowhere near her? His first instinct was to ignore her, to push the thought aside as an inconvenience, as he always did with anything that threatened to disrupt his carefully constructed life. But something held him back. Maya lifted her head slightly, her eyes scanning the room, searching for something, or perhaps someone. Her eyes met his, and for a second, Alexander felt something shift inside him. It wasn't pity, nor was it any sort of compassion. It was more like a challenge, a question he couldn't answer. She wasn't supposed to be here. She didn't belong. His jaw tightened, and he quickly turned away, heading toward the sliding doors to the balcony. The chill of the night air greeted him as he stepped outside, but it didn't ease the discomfort coiling inside him. He didn't know what to make of the feeling, but the image of her, small, lost, and out of place, refused to leave his mind. Maya didn't know how long she stood in the dark corner of the room, her eyes trained on the figure who had caused such a stir inside her. She had watched him from afar, a man whose presence seemed to fill the entire space, even though he was standing still. His clothes were sharp, his posture rigid, but it wasn't his wealth or power that held her attention. It was something deeper. There was a sadness about him, a shadow that clung to him, one that Maya felt a strange connection to. It was as though they were both walking through different worlds, but shared the same emptiness. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she was drawn to him, despite everything she had been taught about people like him. Cold, untouchable, indifferent. But Maya had learned early on that the world was not kind to people like her. In fact, it was cruel. So, when she finally saw a flicker of something in Alexander's eyes, something that hinted at the possibility of empathy, she couldn't help but approach. Maybe, just maybe, he could help her. Maybe he could see her, really see her. Her small feet took hesitant steps forward, but before she could reach him, the man in question turned and disappeared out onto the balcony. Maya's heart sank. The distance between them seemed insurmountable now, and the coldness of the marble floor beneath her bare feet only made her feel more alone. She should have known better than to hope. People like him didn't care about people like her. Still, something inside her stirred, a tiny flame of determination. She couldn't give up. Not now. Not when she was so close to something that could change everything. With a deep breath, Maya stepped forward, intent on finding him, intent on confronting the man who had, for just a moment, made her believe there was someone in this world who might actually care. The balcony overlooked the vast expanse of the city, its lights twinkling like stars scattered across a dark ocean. Alexander leaned against the railing, the cold air biting at his skin, though it did little to dull the unease in his chest. He closed his eyes, trying to push away the image of the little girl. Maya, the girl from the street, the girl who now stood at the edge of his life like a shadow he couldn't escape. He tried to shake it off. It was just a child, a lost, lonely child. There were thousands like her in this city. No need to feel sorry for them. He didn't have the time, the energy, or the will to indulge in emotions that didn't serve him. But the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Maya's eyes, those wide, brown eyes, had lingered in his mind all evening. For a brief moment, when they had met across the room, something had shifted. It wasn't pity. It wasn't even empathy. It was something else, something deeper, an unfamiliar stir of recognition, a feeling that gnawed at his soul. What was it about her? He stepped away from the railing and returned inside, his mind still clouded. The noise of the party was a dull hum in his ears now. The glass of champagne in his hand felt like a weight he couldn't bear. As he moved through the crowd, his gaze searched for her again, but Maya was gone. The place had become suffocating, filled with people who smiled and laughed in a world he no longer understood. Alexander's eyes scanned the room again, a strange sense of urgency building within him. And then he saw her. Maya was standing by the door, looking lost again, her tiny figure barely noticeable in the crowd of well-dressed guests. The contrast between the elegance of the room and her disheveled, pitiful state was stark. The power dynamics were undeniable, but there was something about her that broke through the layers of wealth and status that Alexander had so carefully built around himself. She had no place in this world, and yet she stood there, a silent testament to the emptiness of it all. Without thinking, Alexander moved toward her. He didn't know why. Perhaps it was the sense of guilt that gnawed at him, or perhaps something even more unsettling, the need to protect, to shield her from the world he knew too well. But as he approached, Maya turned and fled, disappearing back into the shadows before he could even speak. He stood there for a long moment, watching her leave. Something in him cracked, a realization settling over him. He had missed his chance. Maya had shown him a part of himself he had buried deep, and in the fleeting seconds he had hesitated, she was gone. Maya had spent the next hour wandering the streets alone, the rain still falling in sheets around her. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away. The world inside the party had been too loud, too bright, too cold. She had hoped for something different, maybe someone who would notice her, someone who would care. But instead, all she had found was indifference. She kept seeing his face, Alexander Knight, the man who had almost seemed to see her, just for a moment. She didn't understand why his presence had felt so familiar, so unsettling. But there was something about him, something that resonated with the emptiness in her own heart. She had felt invisible for so long, always on the edge of people's lives, never truly seen. It was as if the world passed her by, a blur of shadows and light. But that brief moment in the party, when their eyes had locked, Maya had felt a flicker of connection, a sense that for just a second, she had been more than just a lost child in the rain. But now, as she walked alone through the wet streets, she felt the sharp sting of rejection again. No one was going to help her. She had always known that, but in her heart, she had hoped, just for once, that someone might surprise her. Her feet carried her to a small bench beneath a tree, and she sank down onto it, pulling her knees to her chest, shivering from the cold. Her doll lay beside her, its ragged form a reminder of the life she had been forced to leave behind. The silence was overwhelming, the rain falling like 1,000 tiny needles against the earth. And yet, in that moment, Maya felt something shift. The isolation she had known for so long began to feel like a strange kind of strength. She had made it this far alone, without anyone's help, and somehow she had learned to survive. As the city hummed around her, Maya stared into the distance, her thoughts turning inward. She didn't need Alexander. She didn't need anyone. But deep down, a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that this night, this encounter, had changed something. That, somehow, her path and his were entwined in ways neither of them could yet understand. The following days passed in a haze for Alexander. He threw himself back into the chaos of his business empire, letting the noise of the corporate world drown out the thoughts of the small, lost girl. But she lingered in the corners of his mind, refusing to be erased. Her eyes, that look of quiet desperation, yet strength, was something he couldn't forget. He tried to ignore it, to dismiss it as a fleeting moment of weakness. But the more he thought about it, the more the truth gnawed at him. Maya was different. She was not like the people he was used to dealing with. She wasn't looking for money or power. She wasn't asking for anything from him, except maybe the smallest gesture of acknowledgement, the kind of recognition that he had been too busy to give. In the evenings, when the office emptied and he sat alone in his penthouse, Alexander found himself growing restless. His usual comforts, cigars, whiskey, the company of his colleagues, no longer felt sufficient. It was that quiet, aching emptiness again. One evening, after a particularly draining day of meetings, he found himself outside his building, a cigarette dangling from his lips as he stared at the glowing city below. The rain had returned, a soft drizzle that seemed to reflect the heaviness in his heart. He had tried to focus on work, on everything he could control, but the truth was he was starting to lose control over the one thing that had once given him power, his own emotions. As he turned to walk back inside, his eyes caught sight of a figure at the street corner, standing in the rain with her back turned. It was Maya. She stood there, her small frame hunched against the wind, the same doll clutched tightly in her arms. The image was haunting. He didn't think. He only acted, driven by something he couldn't explain. Without a word, he crossed the street and approached her, the soft click of his shoes on the wet pavement the only sound between them. When she heard him, Maya stiffened, and for a brief moment, she looked as if she might run. But when she turned and saw who it was, her eyes widened and she froze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Maya stared at him with a mix of wariness and confusion, as if trying to decide whether he was a friend or another stranger who would let her down. Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "You shouldn't be out here alone." Maya didn't answer immediately. She simply shook her head, looking down at the ground. She was used to people not noticing her, used to being invisible. Why should this man be any different? But something in his tone made her look up again. His expression wasn't one of indifference, nor was it pity. It was something else. "I can help you," he said, though the words seemed foreign to him, as if he were speaking to a different version of himself. For a moment, Maya felt the urge to pull away, to run, to retreat into the shadows where it was safer. But there was a pull, a quiet beckoning in his eyes that stopped her. She hesitated, her heart racing in her chest. "I don't need help," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm fine." But her words rang hollow even to her own ears. The truth was she wasn't fine. She hadn't been fine for a long time. And in that moment, standing in the rain with this stranger, Maya wondered if, for once, she could let someone in. The next morning, Maya woke up in a small, dimly lit room in a shelter on the edge of the city. She had no memory of how she had gotten there. But when she opened her eyes, the dull, gray light filtering through the window told her everything she needed to know. She had been brought here by Alexander. The thought both comforted and disturbed her. She had told him she didn't need his help. But here she was, lying in a bed with fresh blankets, a roof over her head, and a warmth she hadn't felt in what seemed like forever. Her mind raced, replaying the moment in the rain over and over again. His words, his offer of help. He had seen her, truly seen her. And for some reason, it felt like the most terrifying thing in the world. Maya wasn't used to kindness. She wasn't used to people caring. She had learned long ago that the world didn't care about people like her. But here, in this strange room with its pale walls and soft sheets, she couldn't ignore the feeling that maybe, just maybe, she had stumbled into something she wasn't prepared for. Her fingers clutched the doll again, the familiar worn fabric a reminder of who she was, where she came from. It grounded her, as if telling her to hold on to the last bit of herself. The doll was the only thing she had left of the life she had lost. Downstairs, she could hear voices, the soft murmur of conversation. But the noise only seemed to pull her further inside herself. She didn't know what to do with the emotions swirling inside her, the confusion and fear that came with the kindness Alexander had shown her. She had never learned how to accept help. And now, there it was, in the most unexpected form. The door creaked open, and Alexander stepped in, his face softer than she had ever seen it before. He looked almost human, not the aloof, cold man from the party, but someone who had allowed himself to feel something real. "Maya," he said softly, his voice like a lifeline in the quiet room. "How are you feeling?" Her eyes met his, and for the first time, she saw him without the walls of wealth and power. In that moment, he was just a man, reaching out in a way she had never expected. And for the briefest of moments, Maya allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible as she had always feared. Maya's hands trembled as she sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers absently tracing the worn fabric of her doll. She could hear Alexander's footsteps echoing softly down the hallway, his presence both comforting and unsettling. It was a strange thing to be taken in by a stranger, to feel safe in a world that had never offered her any protection. She wanted to believe that things were changing, that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as invisible as she had always thought. But there was a voice inside her, one she'd learned to ignore over the years, that whispered that it wouldn't last. People didn't change. They didn't help you out of the goodness of their hearts. There was always a price to pay. The sound of a door opening snapped her from her thoughts. She didn't look up, but she could feel Alexander standing there, just out of her line of sight. The air between them was thick with the unspoken. "I need to go," Maya said, her voice barely audible but firm. She was used to moving on. It was the only way to survive. She couldn't stay here in a place that was too warm, too safe. She couldn't let herself believe that this was real. "You don't have to leave." Alexander's voice was quiet but persistent. It wasn't a demand, but a plea. He had seen her guarded expression, the way her shoulders tensed as if she were ready to run at any moment. Maya stood up, the weight of his words settling over her like a fog. "I can't stay here," she repeated, her voice shaking just slightly. "You've done enough. I'm fine." "Really?" Alexander's eyes followed her as she moved to the door, but instead of stopping her, he took a deep breath. "Maya," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, I know you don't trust me, but I'm not asking for anything. I just want to help you." His words were like a soft wind against the walls she had so carefully built around herself. Maya paused at the door, her hand on the handle. She wanted to push him away, to flee, but something inside her was starting to crack. She felt the weight of his gaze on her, and for the first time in years, she didn't feel completely alone. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Maya's heart raced in her chest, a mix of fear and something else she couldn't quite name. She knew what she was supposed to do. She was supposed to leave, to disappear. But something in Alexander's eyes made her hesitate. "I don't want to be alone anymore," Maya whispered, her voice breaking slightly. The words escaped her before she could stop them. And in that moment, everything shifted. Alexander didn't move, didn't reach for her, but his gaze softened. It was as if he understood her more than she had ever allowed anyone to. He stepped closer, but only slightly, keeping the distance that Maya needed, though his presence was no less comforting. "You're not alone," he said simply. "Not anymore." Maya closed her eyes, her body trembling slightly as the tension she had carried for so long finally began to unravel. She didn't have to be alone. For the first time, she felt the faintest spark of hope flicker inside her. And as much as she was terrified of it, it felt like a truth she had been denying for far too long. Maya stayed for another night, though she still couldn't quite explain why. The shelter felt like a temporary refuge, a small pause in her otherwise chaotic life. She sat by the window, her eyes staring out into the rainy street as she tried to understand her emotions. How had she gotten here? How had she gone from a lost child on the streets to this strange, uncertain place? It wasn't just the kindness Alexander had shown her that made her stay. It was something deeper, something unspoken that connected them, something that Maya couldn't yet understand. It was the way he didn't ask for anything in return, the way he seemed to see her, not as a problem to fix or a charity case, but as a person. The problem was, Maya wasn't sure if she was ready to let herself be seen. She wasn't sure if she was ready to trust someone enough to let them into the small, fragile world she had built for herself. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not when the world had shown her time and again that people left when you needed them most. And yet, there was something in Alexander's presence that made her believe, even for a moment, that maybe she could let go of the walls she had spent years building. Maybe she could finally let someone in. Downstairs, the soft murmur of conversation filtered up through the floor. She heard Alexander talking to someone. His voice was low and calm, his tone measured as it always was, but there was something different in the way he spoke now. It was like he was letting his guard down, too. Maya stood up, walking quietly to the door. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Perhaps an answer, or maybe just a moment of clarity. But as she stepped into the hallway, she paused at the top of the stairs. For a split second, she saw him, Alexander, standing in the living room, his back turned as he spoke to a man whom Maya didn't recognize. She saw the way he held himself, with a quiet authority, a man who had everything he wanted, but nothing that truly mattered. His life was a carefully constructed facade, and Maya knew that. But there was something else there too, something raw, something real. In the way he had looked at her the night before, something in his eyes had shifted. He wasn't the same man he had been when they first met, and neither was she. Maya couldn't help but wonder, Was it possible to break free of the chains of your past? To start anew, even when everything you've ever known tells you it's impossible? She didn't have the answer, but as she stood there, watching him, she felt a strange sense of connection. And maybe, just maybe, it was the first step towards something she never thought she would find again: trust. Maya didn't sleep much that night. She tossed and turned in the unfamiliar bed, her thoughts racing. The weight of the past always found a way to sneak up on her, even in the quiet moments. Memories of streets that never offered warmth, of faces that never showed concern. She had learned early that people who seemed kind often had their own agendas. She knew that kindness didn't come free. It always had a cost. But Alexander, he was different. He hadn't asked for anything, not once. He hadn't tried to fix her or impose his will on her. He had simply offered her a place to rest, a brief escape from the chaos she had carried for so long. Maya sat up, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The rain still beat against the window, the sound soothing, but also a reminder that nothing about her life had been predictable or safe. It had always been a struggle for survival, never a chance to dream. She had learned to stand on her own, to rely only on herself, because no one else could be trusted. She knew she couldn't stay in this moment forever. She couldn't keep running from her past. But something inside her wanted to stay. She wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, there could be more to life than what she had experienced. Her heart ached at the thought of letting go of the walls she had built. The thought of letting someone close enough to see her wounds, to see the parts of her that were broken, terrified her. She had been abandoned once, and she couldn't bear to feel that emptiness again. But as she looked out the window, at the rain that seemed to wash everything clean, she realized something. Alexander wasn't like the people who had left her. He wasn't like the ones who had betrayed her trust. He hadn't asked her for anything, and yet she couldn't help but feel that he was offering her something that had been lost long ago: hope. The next morning, Maya sat in the kitchen, a cup of tea in her hands, staring at the steam rising from the mud. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that made her feel like she was intruding on something she didn't understand. She was still trying to reconcile the warmth of the house with the cold, solitary world she knew so well. Alexander hadn't said much to her that morning. He'd gone about his routine with a calm precision that she couldn't quite place. It was like he had mastered the art of moving through the world without ever truly letting anyone see him. She watched him from across the room as he moved, his presence steady and composed. But there was something in his eyes when he looked at her that made her heart flutter, a kind of quiet understanding, as though he knew exactly what she was going through without needing to hear the details. Maya set the cup down, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't know what to do next," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to trust." Alexander paused, his gaze softening. He walked toward her slowly, his footsteps measured, as if giving her the space to back away if she wanted. But Maya didn't move. She was too tired of running, too tired of pretending she didn't need anyone. "You don't have to trust me all at once," Alexander said, his voice steady, but there was a tenderness to it that caught her off guard. "Trust is something you build, not something you give away all at once." Maya looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of insincerity. But all she saw was sincerity. There was no hidden agenda, no manipulation. Just a man who had seen pain and knew how to sit with it, without trying to fix it. "I don't know if I'm ready," Maya whispered, her voice breaking just slightly. The words tasted foreign on her tongue. "I don't know how to trust again." "I understand," he replied quietly. "But you don't have to do it alone. Not anymore." Maya swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. She could feel the walls inside her beginning to crack, and for the first time in years, she didn't want to close them off. She wanted to trust. She wanted to believe that she wasn't alone. But the scars of her past ran deep. They weren't something that could be erased with kind words or gestures. They were a part of her now, woven into the fabric of who she was. And yet, something in her heart, a quiet, fragile hope, began to stir. "I don't know how to let you in," Maya said softly, her voice barely audible. "You don't have to know," Alexander answered. "You just have to be willing to try." And for the first time in a long time, Maya allowed herself to believe that trying might be enough. The following days passed in a haze of quiet moments and unspoken thoughts. Maya found herself caught between two worlds, the one she had known, where trust was a fragile illusion, and the one she was slowly stepping into, where Alexander's steady presence offered something she had long since abandoned, the possibility of peace. They spent hours talking, no longer in silence, but in small, careful conversations about trivial things. Her favorite books, his childhood memories, the odd little habits they both had. It was a slow dance of words and gestures, each one a tentative step forward. But even in these small exchanges, Maya couldn't help but notice how natural it felt. How, for the first time in years, she wasn't pretending to be someone she wasn't. Alexander, though still a mystery in many ways, had become a source of comfort. He didn't rush her, didn't demand that she share everything at once. He seemed content to wait, letting her come to him on her own time, offering her space without letting her retreat too far. In moments of quiet, Maya could feel the shift within herself, the subtle uncoiling of the walls she had built around her heart. One morning, as they sat at the breakfast table, Maya watched him over the rim of her coffee cup. He had a way of being present in a room, of filling it with his calm energy without ever pushing anyone. She could tell he was used to being in control, to taking charge when necessary. But with her, there was something different, something softer. "You never talk about your past," Maya said quietly, setting her cup down. "What happened to you before all of this?" For a moment, the warmth in his eyes dimmed, and he looked away, as if the question had taken him by surprise. Maya immediately regretted asking. She didn't want to push him, not now. Not when she was still learning how to trust herself. But Alexander didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze turning inward for a moment. "There's not much to tell," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I grew up in a world that demanded perfection. Every mistake was magnified. Every failure was a failure of character. It wasn't easy, but I survived." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken pain. But there was something in his delivery that made Maya want to know more. She sensed the walls he had built around himself, walls just as high as hers, but she could also see the cracks in them, small, barely visible, but enough for her to catch a glimpse of what lay beneath. Maya couldn't help but feel a pull toward him. She wanted to understand, wanted to reach out and offer him the same comfort he had given her. But her own walls were still there, still protecting her from the world and from herself. "I think we both have our own scars," she said, her voice soft, almost to herself. "Maybe that's why it's so hard to trust." Alexander met her gaze, his eyes filled with understanding. And for the first time, Maya felt like she wasn't alone in her pain. There was something about the way he looked at her, as if he could see right through her, but in a way that didn't make her feel exposed. It was as if he was offering her a safe space to be broken, without judgment. And in that moment, something shifted inside Maya. The need to protect herself, to guard her heart, began to lose its grip. She realized that perhaps trust wasn't about being perfect. It was about being willing to take a risk, to open up even when it felt impossible. The days that followed were marked by small moments of growth. Maya allowing herself to linger in the warmth of Alexander's home a little longer, allowing herself to enjoy the moments of peace that had once felt so foreign. She would wake up in the mornings to find him already downstairs, preparing breakfast, his quiet presence grounding her before the chaos of her mind could take over. On one particular evening, as they sat together on the back porch, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Maya found herself thinking about the choices she had made in her life. The road she had walked, the mistakes she had made, the things she had lost. "I never thought I'd end up here," she said softly, her gaze focused on the horizon. "I thought I'd be running forever, that I'd never find a place where I could feel safe." Alexander didn't respond right away. He simply sat beside her, his presence a silent support. But after a moment, he spoke, his voice low and contemplative. "Maybe we're all running from something, Maya, but you don't have to keep running. Not anymore." Maya turned to him, her eyes searching his face. She could see the sincerity in his gaze, the quiet understanding that he was offering her a choice to stay, to stop running, to allow herself to heal. For the first time in years, Maya felt the weight of her past lift just slightly. She didn't have to have all the answers. She didn't need to fix everything at once. All she needed to do in that moment was decide if she was ready to stay. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in twilight, Maya made her decision. She wasn't ready to let go of everything. She wasn't ready to erase her past. But she was ready to take a step forward, to take the risk of trusting, of allowing herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a future where she wasn't alone. "I'll stay," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but the words were enough. Maya woke to a chill in the room, a silent reminder that her dreams were never as peaceful as they seemed. Her mind kept racing, replaying memories from a life she had tried so hard to leave behind. The streets she used to walk, the faces of strangers who had become all too familiar in their indifference. She could never fully escape that feeling of being unseen, of being a shadow in the world, slipping through unnoticed. But here with Alexander, it was different. The house felt warm, and there was a quiet promise of something better, something safe. She had allowed herself to believe it, just for a moment. But that moment always seemed to end with her waking up in a cold sweat, haunted by a past she couldn't outrun. She stood by the window, looking out at the early morning light filtering through the trees. The world felt still, and for the briefest second, it seemed like the weight of the past wasn't following her, wasn't hovering just behind her shoulder. But then the silence broke. Alexander's voice, soft but steady, came from the doorway. "I thought you'd be up. You're always the first to rise." Maya turned, her hand clutching the edge of the curtain, as if trying to hold on to the calmness of the moment. She hadn't even realized she was holding her breath. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, her voice quieter than usual. "I keep thinking about everything. My past, the things I can't change." She stepped away from the window, her eyes meeting his. "Do you ever feel like you're running from something that's always right behind you?" Alexander didn't answer immediately. He seemed to search her face, as if trying to understand the depth of what she was saying. There was a tenderness in his eyes, a kind of understanding she hadn't expected. "I think we all have something we're running from," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "But maybe it's not the running that matters. Maybe it's what you choose to do once you stop." Maya couldn't help but feel the weight of his words. She had spent so much of her life running, hiding from her past, thinking that if she could just outrun it, it would go away. But it never did. It always found her in the quiet moments, in the darkness of her thoughts. She swallowed hard, her throat tight. "I don't know if I can stop running." "You don't have to do it alone," he said, stepping closer. "You don't have to carry it by yourself anymore, Maya." His words hit her like a wave, crashing over her. And for the first time in so long, she felt something break within her, something she hadn't even known was still there. "Maybe," she whispered, looking down at her hands, "maybe I could learn to stop." The next few days were a blur of simple moments. Breakfast shared in silence, the soft sound of Alexander's footsteps around the house, the comforting hum of a life that didn't demand anything of her. Maya had never known a life like this, one where she didn't have to worry about the next move, about what she had to do to survive. She could simply exist. But even in this peace, there was a tension building within her, a fear that the calm wouldn't last, that the moment she allowed herself to believe in something more, it would be ripped away, just like everything else she had ever known. Still, she found herself opening up more, slowly revealing parts of herself she had kept hidden for so long. Little things, like how she used to love painting but hadn't touched a brush in years because it felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Or how, when she was younger, she dreamed of becoming a teacher, of helping children who had grown up in the same kind of pain she had known. Each time she shared something with Alexander, something inside her seemed to shift, like a piece of the puzzle she had spent so long trying to put together. And with each small piece, she realized just how much of herself she had left behind, how much of her own dreams she had buried in order to survive. But there was still so much fear. Fear that she would never be able to truly heal. Fear that the moment she allowed herself to trust someone, she would lose everything. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Maya's thoughts were consumed with what she had to do next. She wanted to take the next step, wanted to believe in the possibility of a future without fear. But she was terrified. Terrified that if she gave herself completely to him, it would be the very thing that would break her. Alexander, sensing her unease, turned to her, his voice soft. "You don't have to decide everything right now, Maya. Take your time. You don't need to rush." But Maya knew, deep down, that the real decision wasn't about rushing, it was about trusting. About believing that, for once, she wasn't alone in the world. "I want to trust you," she said, her voice barely audible. "But I'm scared. I'm scared of being let down again." "You're not alone in this, Maya," he replied gently, his hand reaching out to her, offering comfort. "You don't have to face it alone." She looked at his hand, at the warmth it offered, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his, and in that simple touch, she felt something stir inside her, a hope, fragile but real, that maybe, just maybe, she could start to heal. The days bled into each other, as though time itself had slowed in the peaceful cocoon Maya had found within Alexander's world. Each morning felt like a reprieve from her nightmares, and yet, the shadows of her past still clung to her. They were there, lurking just beneath the surface of her every thought, a reminder that no matter how far she ran, they would always be there. One evening, as the fading sunlight painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, Alexander took Maya's hand in his. The familiar warmth of his touch stirred something in her, a desire to let go of her fears, to allow herself to believe in something better. But, as always, doubt lingered in the corners of her mind. "There's something I need to tell you," she whispered, her voice tight, barely audible. Alexander looked at her with those steady eyes, waiting, patient as ever. His gaze never wavered, but Maya could see the flicker of concern behind them. "What is it, Maya?" She closed her eyes, trying to steady herself. This was the moment where the mask she had worn for so long would finally come off. But was she ready to face the truth, to let him see her completely? Could she bear to let him in, to reveal the scars she had hidden for so long? "I'm not the person you think I am," she said, her words falling into the silence like a stone dropped into still water. "I didn't just lose my parents when I was young. I lost everything. I lived on the streets for years. She paused, swallowing hard, her chest tightening with every word. "I did things, terrible things just to survive." The confession felt like an avalanche crashing down on her, as though everything she had tried to bury was finally tumbling to the surface. She kept her eyes fixed on the ground, afraid to look up, afraid to see his reaction. Would he pull away? Would he see her as nothing more than a broken, unworthy girl? For a long time, there was only silence. Then, gently, Alexander lifted her chin, making her look at him. His expression was unreadable, but there was no anger, no disgust. Just a quiet understanding. "Maya," he said softly, his voice steady, "I don't care what you've done in your past. What matters is who you are now." His words were a balm to the wound she had carried for so long. She had always thought that her past defined her, that the things she had done, the things she had survived, would always haunt her. But his words, they felt like the first real chance she had ever been given to truly start over. "But you don't understand," she whispered, voice shaking. "I'm not clean. I'm not pure. I don't deserve you. I don't deserve this life. Life doesn't owe us purity," he replied gently, pulling her into his arms. "It doesn't owe us anything. What matters is that we choose who we are every single day. And I choose you, Maya. I choose you for everything you are." Maya's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever said those words to her before. She had always been seen as someone broken, as someone who could never be whole again. But here, in his arms, she felt a flicker of hope, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. "I'm scared," she confessed, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm scared that I'll ruin this, that I'll ruin everything." Alexander's hands gently cupped her face, and for the first time, Maya allowed herself to lean into him fully, to let go of the fear and the uncertainty that had kept her tethered to her past. "You won't ruin this," he said softly, his thumb tracing the outline of her jaw. We'll take it one step at a time, together. The days that followed were both healing and difficult. Maya spent hours reflecting on Alexander's words, questioning her own self-worth and her place in the world. She had never imagined that someone could see past her scars, past the history she carried like a heavy weight. But Alexander saw her, not the girl she had been, not the mistake she had made, but the woman standing before him, vulnerable and uncertain, but willing to try. One afternoon, they sat together on the porch, the sun warming their faces as they talked about everything and nothing at all. For a moment, Maya allowed herself to just be. She let go of the fear that always gnawed at her, the fear that if she looked too long into this piece, it would shatter like glass. "Maya, can I ask you something?" Alexander's voice was low, his gaze focused on her with that steady, searching intensity she had come to trust. "Of course," she replied, though she could feel the weight of his question hanging in the air. "I know you've had a hard past." He began slowly, his words measured. "But what is it that you really want? What are you fighting for now?" Maya took a deep breath, her chest tightening as she thought about it. What was she fighting for? For so long, her fight had been about survival, about keeping her head above water, about enduring the pain. But now there was something different, something worth fighting for. "I want a chance to live without fear," she said softly, her voice breaking slightly. "I want to believe that I can start over, that I can be someone worth loving. I want a future, a real future." Her heart hammered in her chest as she spoke those words, afraid of what they might mean, afraid that by voicing them, she might destroy the fragile hope she had built. Alexander's expression softened, his eyes full of tenderness. "You're not alone in this fight, Maya. I'm here, and I'll always be here." She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. The words were simple, but they meant everything to her. And for the first time, as the wind rustled the leaves around them, Maya allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something more, something better. The days grew warmer, the skies clearer, but Maya's heart was still heavy with an uncertainty she couldn't shake. Despite the love and care Alexander showed her, there was a storm within her she couldn't quite understand. The fear that had been her constant companion for years had not disappeared overnight, no matter how much she wanted it to. She knew that to truly heal, to truly embrace the life that was unfolding before her, she would have to confront the darkness within. One evening, as the sun began to set in a cascade of orange and pink across the sky, Maya found herself standing at the edge of the garden, looking out over the rolling hills beyond. She had always loved the quiet of the evenings here, the way the world seemed to slow, giving her a moment of respite from the chaos in her mind. Alexander approached her quietly, his steps soft on the grass. When he reached her, he didn't speak at first. He just stood there, watching her, letting the silence stretch between them. "What's wrong?" His voice was gentle, but there was an edge of concern that made Maya turn toward him, her eyes meeting his. She wasn't ready for the conversation, not yet, but she knew it was coming. She couldn't keep hiding from the truth. "I don't know if I'm ready to be someone else," Maya confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm scared that if I let go of my past, I'll lose myself. That if I let go of all the pain, I won't know who I am anymore." Alexander didn't speak right away. He simply took her hand in his grip warm and steady. Then, slowly, he led her toward the bench under the large oak tree, the one where they often sat together in the evenings. "Maya," he began softly, "you're not losing yourself. You're finding yourself. The person you were in the past is part of who you are now, but you don't have to live in that place forever. You deserve to be free of that pain. You deserve a chance to rebuild." His words cut through the fog of doubt in her mind, settling deep in her heart. She had never considered it that way before. She had always believed that the weight of her past would forever shape her future, that it was an unshakable part of who she was. But Alexander was showing her that she could rewrite her story. She could change. "I want to believe you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But it's hard. So hard." "I know," he said, his voice thick with understanding. "But I'll be here, every step of the way." His promise was simple, but it was all she needed. For the first time in years, Maya felt like there might be a future worth fighting for. Not just one where she survived, but one where she truly lived. The days that followed were not easy. Maya faced the demons of her past head-on, confronting the guilt, the shame, and the fear that had governed her every decision for so long. She learned to forgive herself, one small step at a time, with Alexander beside her, offering quiet support and endless patience. But it wasn't just the inner battles she fought, it was the outer ones as well. Word had gotten out about her past. The press had caught wind of the story of the runaway girl who had risen from the streets, and with it came the judgment, the criticism, the whispers. People who had once adored Alexander were now questioning his choice to be with her, to stand by her. Maya could see the disappointment in their eyes, the subtle but unmistakable disapproval. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of being hounded by reporters, Maya sat on the balcony overlooking the sprawling estate. Her fingers traced the glass railing as she watched the lights of the city twinkle in the distance. Her heart felt heavy, the weight of the world pressing down on her. "Maya," Alexander said quietly from behind her, his voice carrying a mixture of worry and determination. "You're not alone in this. I don't want to be a burden," she replied, her voice shaky. "I don't want to drag you down with me." He stepped closer, standing beside her, his presence a quiet comfort. "You're not a burden. You never were." Her eyes met his, and for a long moment, there was nothing but the silent understanding that passed between them. The world outside was loud and unkind, but in this moment, in his arms, Maya found peace. "I'm scared, Alexander," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I'm scared that I'm not good enough for you, that I'll never be able to be the person you deserve." "You are good enough," he said firmly, "and if you ever doubt that, I'll remind you every day. You've already shown me how strong you are, how resilient." Maya felt the tears sting her eyes, but this time they were different. They weren't born of sorrow, but of release. She let them fall, not as a sign of weakness, but as a recognition of how far she had come, how far they had come together. In the days that followed, Maya took a deep breath and made a choice. She would no longer allow her past to define her. She would no longer allow the world's judgment to dictate her worth. She was going to live her life with Alexander, and together, they would face whatever challenges came their way. The press would keep hounding them, the whispers would continue, but Maya no longer cared. She had chosen her path, and for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace with who she was becoming. "I love you," she whispered, her voice full of raw emotion. Alexander smiled, his eyes filled with an intensity that took her breath away. "And I love you, more than you'll ever know." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Maya leaned into him, feeling the warmth of his embrace. They didn't know what the future would bring, but in that moment, they didn't need to. All that mattered was that they had each other. In the end, Maya's journey reminds us all that the shadows of our past do not define who we are meant to be. It's not the pain we've endured, but the strength to rise, to forgive ourselves, and to embrace the love that's waiting for us that shapes our true identity. Her story is a testament to resilience, a celebration of finding peace within, and it's a story that could be your own. If Maya's journey moved you, if you felt the weight of her struggles and the power of her triumphs, don't keep it to yourself. Share this story with others who need to hear it. Leave a comment below. Tell us how Maya's transformation spoke to your heart. Like this video if you believe in second chances, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that inspire, challenge, and touch your soul. Because just like Maya, you deserve to live the life you've always dreamed of. Let's keep this story going together.